There's definitely going to be a few F# talks throughout the Strange Loop conference. So if you're interested more in the F# side, then check out the Strange Loop schedule. I'm sure there's a talk on Friday that covers type providers as well. But I'm going to be talking about sort of something slightly different. And that's this project that I've been working on recently. And as any PhD student who's working on their thesis, I spend a lot of time reading unrelated stuff on the internet, in the newspaper. But it was actually useful because there's this really interesting thing that's been happening in the journalism area recently, which some people call data journalism. So I just have an example here. This is a title page from The Guardian where they're saying that China overtook the US as the world's largest producer of carbon emissions. This article is actually quite old. It's from 2007. So I'm just going to click on another one. This one didn't even have any charts in it, so you wouldn't really see how the carbon emission change is happening. But if I can manage to close this ad, no, yeah. So in Economist, they do have a bunch of interesting visualizations. This one is the interesting chart here, which shows when, and this is sometime in 2007, when China became larger producer of carbon emissions than the US. And what you can see today in a lot of newspapers is that they're actually using some publicly available data to tell interesting things. There's a lot of interesting data sources. The UK and the US have open government data initiatives where the governments put out a lot more data about what's happening, things like police reports or housing prices. And the journalists are using this data to tell something really interesting about the world around you. This is just really a basic chart. You can't do too much with it. And some of them are building more interactive visualizations where you can actually add or remove indicators and so on. And as a programmer looking at this, I'm always curious about what's behind it. So for example, here, there's two things that I think are sort of missing in what's happening in the media. The first one is transparency. So if you look at the article, it says that China is the biggest polluter, and so they're the most evil country. But is it really the case? What if we look at not the total amount of carbon emissions produced, but look at carbon emissions per capita? Does that change the story? There was another really great motivation for me to start working on this, which is I'm from Czech Republic, and the Ministry of Education said that there's too many people in Czech Republic going to universities. I was like, what? And they did have some charts showing how it's really dangerously growing. And if you just add another indicator and compare it to, say, OECD or the European Union or the US, it's not really true. And this all comes from the fact that they can show you just some of the subset of the data, but they don't give you the ability to change it. The other thing is, can we actually reproduce it? If we try to do exactly the same thing, do we get the right numbers? And this is something that's important in science. There's a lot of things happening in the economy where in economics where, for example, the famous Piketty's recent Capital book, that received a lot of criticism because some people weren't able to reproduce some of it. There's also a fairly well-known paper on growth in the time of depth, where it turned out that they just incorrectly copied some parts of Excel spreadsheet and ended up saying completely opposite things. And that's something that's really easy to do when you just copy stuff in Excel spreadsheet, because, yeah, you can easily make a mistake. And that's where I think this is, the data journalism is interesting, because what the data journalists are doing is that they work with data, but very often the methods they use aren't super advanced. So in general, what's data journalism doing? The idea is when there's some interesting story, something interesting happening in the world, they try to get access to some data about the story or related to the story. They might go to the White House and use some of the laws and regulations to actually ask the government for the data. Then the government says, no, we don't want to give it to you. And then there's a lawsuit, and 5 years later, they do get the data. More often, if they're lucky, there's some data available. I'll be using the World Bank as an example, which is an international organization that collects data about countries. And then they turn it into something relevant to the story, some interactive visualizations that we can look at. And previously, I just had an example with a chart. And that, if you have just a chart, then yeah, you can just use it, use Excel, produce a chart, or I was talking with some journalists, and they apparently have a team that draws the charts in Photoshop to make them look nice. If you come to this as a programmer, or when I come to it as a programmer, I really don't see just the chart. I'm interested in what's behind it. And that's where all the motivations for what I'm talking about comes from. So can we actually reproduce it? If the visualization is using some open government data source, can we go again from the data in the source to the visualization? Can we get the source code? If you look at the Economist article, they didn't give me the source code to build the chart, which is very disappointing. Also, where does the data come from? Does it come from the World Bank, or is it just some random CSV someone found on the internet? So the key idea behind what I want to talk about here is, if you look at these data-driven articles, really you can see it as a program. And you can see it as a program that you can run, and it produces some visualization. But when you see it as a program, there's a lot of things that we can do with programs as well. So I want to start with a quick demo, and I'll show you an example of what I was working on. So this is an example that looks at carbon emissions. Let me make it a bit smaller. And when you come to the page, it looks just like a normal newspaper article with some text, and there's a little chart. And this chart here is showing carbon emissions per country as a total. So you can see that if we are looking at 2010, and China is the biggest producer of carbon emissions, and then we can look at the other countries. We have a table showing the total numbers, and there's another chart. This one I think is quite interesting. It shows if you take China, US, and India, they together are producing roughly half of the world's carbon emissions. So that's the first example. And what you see when you come to the page is some sort of view of the program. So the source for this is really just some text and some source code. And I'll show that in a second. When you come to the page, you see the journalist's story. So what the journalists are doing is that they have some story to say, and they're helping us understand, or they try to sort of put the things in a context. So you still want to start with what they have to say, but then you can modify the parameters, and maybe see something that isn't entirely obvious, or maybe even find something that's actually missed in the story. And I want to let the users who can deal with some code actually see the code as well. So let me show you how this looks. If I go here, there's, and the projector does actually show it. The gray is sometimes invisible. So there's this options button, and this gives you some options for the visualization, and this is still something that some of the better data journalism articles have, where we can change some parameters. So for example, we can have a look at the data for, let's say, 1980. And this is interesting. There's actually data for the former Eastern Bloc. It's not available, but we can see that in 80s, US was producing more carbon emissions than China. The other thing I can do here is to look at different indicators. So we can actually have a look at the carbon emissions per capita rather than the total. And the other interesting thing that's happening here is that you can see on the right, there's the panel with some metadata. And this is actually all generated automatically from the data source. So here I'm using data from the World Bank, and they have lots of indicators about different countries, about climate change and so on. And this is importing all the data. So let's have a look at emissions per capita. And here, again, the picture looks a lot different. I think there's some of the really small countries in this area have like really large carbon emissions per capita. And then China, who was really red on the previous picture, isn't that red anymore. So this is what you get as a user. And I intentionally started from the sort of really simple things. So this is the kind of interactions that anyone coming to the website can do. But what I'm really interested in is the program behind it. So what's behind this is, as was mentioned before, this is using the F# language. But the key idea is just a simple functional programming language that has this idea called type providers. How many people have heard type providers before the introduction to this talk? Yeah, good. So now everybody knows type providers are awesome. I'll show you why. But there's a couple of things in the language, and let me actually just show you the code first. So when I click on the source here, I'll make it bigger, although it might mess up the charts. We'll see. So the hardest thing in the first example was picking the right colors. So that's what's happening on the first 3 lines. But then this bit is saying, this is my data source. And this is where type providers come in. So if I delete this and actually start typing, it offers me completion. So this is something that programmers are really used to, at least in statically typed languages. And F# takes it a bit further. So I can do by year, and then it offers me the years that are available. And the years here, they're actually coming from the World Bank. So this asks the World Bank, what years do you have? And World Bank says, I have all these years. We can pick 1 year. And then again, it asks the World Bank, what are the categories of indicators? So I can pick climate change. And then I can continue here and choose some indicator. So let's have a look, for example, at something different, electric power consumption. And the thing that didn't fit, but maybe it will fit if I make it a bit smaller, let's try again, is that you still get the information with the metadata. So the exactly same thing that I was using before in the really simple end-user mode, where I was just picking things in drop-down, it's actually coming from the program behind it. So what's happening here is that the type provider mechanism is integrating external data into the language, and it generates these types that have all these properties, and the properties have some documentation attached to them, which is also provided from the World Bank, and that's what I can access here. If I look at something else, so let's say this one, here the source code does a little bit of calculation. So we get, for every country, we get the number, we sort it, and then we take we skip the first 6 and sum the rest, which generates this purple bit. And we take the first 6 and add the rest to it. So this is something where, if I look at the options, that's actually not exposed here. But I can go to the source code and make some more changes. And I did want to say a few things here. So what's behind it is that we're using really simple functional programming style to do the transformations, like skip, take, do some mapping, and so on. But I think if you take functional programming has this horrible reputation of being really complicated and being about endo-functors. But if you just take the core good parts of it, then it's really simple. We're relying on the static typing, which gives us this nice editor support. And I'm not sure if that's the only way to do it, but it works pretty well. And it's using the type provider mechanism to integrate the external data into the language. Now, I was only showing you the article as it looks when you render it, but if you want to see the source code, it's actually just a markdown page that GitHub can render. I could show you the raw source if you want it. It's just text with some code. So that's where, when I was saying there's no magic behind it, it really is just text and a few smaller snippets of code. And I think that's really important because you want to see how the whole thing is created, especially if it's supposed to be reproducible and transparent. So there's some interesting things in the technology behind it. I think the first one is the World Bank data source. So the type provider mechanism is fairly general, and you could integrate lots of different data sources into the system. I just haven't, the one sample I have done is the World Bank, and the World Bank has this 3-dimensional cube where they have information for different countries, they have lots of different indicators, and they have it for different years. And when we were accessing it here, we did some slicing through the space. So we picked the year, let's say 2010, then we pick an indicator like carbon emissions, and we get a single line or slice from the data set, which is some sort of series that for every country gives you a different number. So that's what was happening here, and the system has the other slicing where you say, give me the data for specific country and indicator, and you get the time series. Or you could continue and actually slice it by all the 3 and get just a single value, single number. And what's interesting with the type providers is that they give you a way to map these more interesting, more structured spaces into the programming environment. So a lot of the visualization tools, they're just built on top of spreadsheets, where spreadsheet is really just a 2-dimensional table, and that's it. But if you look at things like the open government data sources, it really has much richer structure. And I think that's where the type providers are interesting, because you can transform the richer structure into something that fits in the programming world. And the World Bank type provider just does two different slicings of the space. So you start with the world, which is just a top-level object, and that exposes the data by country or by year, where you can pick a country or pick a year. And then it gives you access to all the leaves, which are the indicators. And for convenience, because there's thousands of them, they're actually grouped in different categories. So if I went back here, and rather than looking at climate change, if I choose all indicators, this will either crash my browser or never complete. Yeah, this will probably never complete. Because the World Bank exposes something, hey, something like thousands different indicators. So I'm going to hold page down, not arrow down, just to show you what's there. And you can access all of this in a nice programmatic way. Yeah, I don't even know what it means. This makes sense. So you can map these external data sources into a nice programming environment. The other thing that I find really interesting is when I was showing the example with the options, it gives you the nice drop-downs. This is, again, not something that the journalists have to specify explicitly. I think it would be useful to have an option to control it, but at the moment, that's all automatically generated. And the way it works is that because the article is a program, we can look at the program and do some simple analysis. So when I was showing the drop-down, that really just looks at code with this sort of structure, a pattern, where I'm accessing one of members of some object. So here, climate change returns some object which has a lot of properties or members, and one of them is carbon emissions, and a lot of these members have the same type. So they're a series that maps string to a float. And when the editor finds this pattern, it will give you an option to choose one of these members. Because replacing CO2 emissions with anything else of the same type will not break the code, so we can safely do it. And it's one pattern that we are detecting. So if let's do it here. If I go to source and options, I have the carbon emissions down here. If I choose something else, this actually edits the source code. So the drop-down is just projection from part of the source code that can then push the changes back into the code. The other one is when I have list of these. So that's right at the end of the article. There's another, whoa, let me refresh this. That's not what's supposed to be there, as you can tell. But it really likes to be there. Well, that's the fun with live demos. If it doesn't work, then I'll just pretend you did see another nice example. I might need the internet as well. Yeah, anyway, there's another, I'll show it if it loads. So the other interesting thing that I had in the article was comparison of different countries and how the values change over time. Hey, there it is. So here I just explicitly picked some countries. I picked China, India, Japan, Russia, and US to show you a comparison. So this is the same with just China and US. It's the same chart that Economist had. And you can see China overtaking the US here around 2005. But as a reader, I always want to add more countries and see, for example, how Czech Republic is doing in comparison. And so there's this other editor here, which is generated when you have a list of things. So I have a list of countries I want to compare, and generated editor. If we replace Russia and add Czech Republic instead, then it changes the source code, so you can see the changes live. If we refresh it, we'll see that Czech Republic isn't producing too much carbon emissions. So I think that's just two of the interesting things you can do. There's, I think, a lot of potential for other things, like when you have numerical constants that fall in some range, we can just use the normal programming language tricks to figure out what's the range and give the user some sort of bar for picking the value. And that all comes from the idea of just treating the article or the report as a program. So I'll just say a few things about possible ideas. I actually think the first thing, and this is relating to the lunch discussion we had with Sean, the first interesting problem here is that people don't really see this as a programming language research. So if I say future directions, I think what we need is more of a method for looking at these kind of programming experiences as a research problem. If I was doing this talk at ICFP or any other functional programming conference, I would say we need to formalize it and we need some proofs. But I don't actually think that's what matters here. So I have a few ideas for other interesting things you could do with this, and the basic structure that the reports are using is really inspired by literate programming, which I don't think there's been much work on that since Knut came up with the term. So, for example, when you're writing a report where in the text you're showing some number, you say carbon emissions of the US is this number of billions, that's not really telling user very much. But if it was connected to the data source, the web page could show you how does this compare to other countries, or how has it been changing, just based on the fact that we know where the data is coming from. And in programming languages, this is what all the provenance research or context-aware programming research was doing. And I really think data journalism is an interesting area where a lot of it could be used. The other interesting problem is the World Bank. Mapping that into the type provider is fairly easy because it's really just a three-dimensional cube. But if you look at the open government data sources, they tend to be really complicated and fairly messy. Some governments think that good format for open data is PDF, which turns out to be really impossible to scrape. But being able to map the whole open government data into a type system, I think that's a fun problem. And also, a lot of the visualizations I was showing are kind of primitive. I was using Google Charts, but there's probably a lot more that the people working on things like reactive programming could actually bring to this nice interactive visualization world. All right, so that's pretty much all I wanted to say. I'm really looking for people who would be interested in playing with this, using this. So I don't suspect there's many journalists in the room, but if you're working on some internal reporting, you could use pretty much the same ideas. But just rather than mapping the World Bank and climate change information, you can put your internal database with customers and sales into the programming language and build some really interesting visualizations that let the readers interact and you can actually trust them. So the few things in summary, I think there's really important theme, which is the general information literacy, because there's so much data that you can access these days, and making some sense out of it is really hard. So that's where I think my motivation for this kind of work comes from. The one key thing that I think makes this all nice possible is treating the article as a program. And I think having nice programming environment that actually lets people without too much programming skills do some fun things, that's the future of usable programming. Thank you. And I think we have 5 minutes for questions. Yeah.
Why doesn't it show the category in the options?
The question is why it didn't show the category in the options. So in the source code, why I don't have a drop-down for this. So that's actually because if I change the category, if I just substituted the category, then I could probably break the program because the other categories wouldn't have the CO2 emissions. More technically, it's because when I do dot here, when I do dot and it doesn't automatically complete the one I had there before, all these things, all these fields have different type. So education has type education category, and it's different than energy and mining, which has a type energy and mining category. So here I'm choosing between multiple properties, but they all have the same type. It's like if I had customer and they had name, age, address, I can't just switch one of these because it wouldn't fit with the rest of the program. But I did actually want to have like a specific editor for two-level field access because the structure with category dot something seems to be fairly useful. So yeah, that's one thing that would make sense to add. But as it is, it's only doing when you have one field out of several that have exactly the same type. Yeah?
Where are the values defined, the properties?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So where are the values and where are the properties actually set up and configured? Because that's something that wasn't in my nice clean source code. So you can have a look at the code if you want later, but there's another part of the project which implements the type provider for the World Bank, and that's a piece of F# code that defines how to generate these types. So that's a piece of code that looks at the World Bank, calls their API, and asks what are all the indicators you have, what are all the countries you have, and then it generates some F# types that are then exposed in the editor. So the mapping part is where I think the journalists will need some help from programmers. The building of the reports on top of the data sources, once we have the mapping for them, that's the nicely usable part.
So that has to be done, since F# is a statically typed language, right? So all that generation of properties has to be done statically.
So the question is if F#, because F# is a statically typed language, does the generation have to be done explicitly? And the answer is sort of. So for what I get here is like just one specific data source. So I have a nice type provider for World Bank, which gives you this really easy and friendly way of calling it. I do have another type provider, which is fairly general and works with any JSON-based data source. And what that does is that you just point it at a sample response from some service, and it will infer the types from the sample response. And then it gives you dot-based nice programming style based on that sample JSON response. So that works with any JSON-based source. It can map any JSON-based service into the programming environment. It isn't as beautiful as this one, but you still get a lot of the experience. I think that's another area where there's probably a lot more that could be done, because there's also sort of general-based linked data sources which have some structure around them that could be mapped in a fairly general, reusable way into the language. Other questions?
What does the gamma mean?
Oh, why is it the gamma? It's a programming language theory joke. Because all the programming language theoreticians have this typing judgment where you say, in a context, program E has a type tau, and all the programming language theoreticians always say, initially the context is empty. There's nothing. But really, what you have initially in the context is this projection from everything you have in the world into the context. So the pi here is the sort of type provider, and that's why it's the gamma. But
You're prepared for that question.
if it ever gets commercially successful, I'll have to come up with some better explanation. Yeah?
So you say that the article is a program. So that means that part of the program is the text. But the text is sort of like a comment, and then when you change the program, the comment is kind of irrelevant. So I think that needs some different narrative around
Yeah.
what you've done.
Yeah, I think, so the comment was, I say that the article is a program, but really in my example, it's text and some code. I think I would like it to be the case that the article is really the program. I just don't have that much in the text part yet. But I think it's potentially interesting to see how the two could be more closely intertwined. One thing you could imagine is if you come to the same article in the future and the values changes, it actually adapts some parts of the text. And then the text would be more mixed with the code, where if you say, had some sort of conditionals in the text and so on, or embedding of values into the text. So I think there's more that could be done to actually have that slogan be true. But yeah, in the current version, it's not going that far.